Hello, everybody. I'm John Marks, Editorial Director of African Energy, and we're here to talk through, very briefly, the issue 446 that was absolutely filled with a wide variety of stuff. And I have here with me Dan Marks, Power Editor of African Energy. So, hello, Dan. Thanks to Harry Randle-Marsh, as ever, for setting this up. It was a big issue with many diverse factors in it. We started looking at gas issues around Mozambique and South Africa, significant factors. Even though gas is being really talked down in the energy transition, the fact is a lot of important work is going on around the industry, and also a lot of extremely powerful and in some cases deadly politics. We looked at a number of other issues, from battery storage with a report from our latest AIX online conference, which was on the potential for on and off-grid batteries. That situation is moving, and it won't be a surprise to many of you listening to know that one of the big issues is financing. We looked at a number of power issues, quite a lot in the upstream. We had a very interesting article in downstream about how Egypt fits into the US-backed deal on Lebanon. A political deal to supply gas in the Eastern Mediterranean, in which both my colleagues, John Hamilton and James Gavin, fed in a lot of stuff. And on the really policy side, John Hamilton, a long-time Libya watcher, went and looked at how Prime Minister Dbeibah, a real political mover and shaker with a very great view on how to control money, has emerged on top in the battle between NOC Chief Sinala and Energy Minister Aoun in Libya. Libyan issues continue, of course, a country not at peace, but actually where we're hearing quite a lot of oils on the market now that they can't sell. And finally, as well on the power side, we ended with a substantial article put together by David Slater and our Guinea research team, which does quite a lot of work on that country for African Energy's parent, Cross-Border Information, on how the new regime in Guinea was bedding in, looking at the appointments, looking at the machinations around the vital mining sector. Very powerful stuff. Now, I'm delighted to have Dan on the call because he sandwiched two articles between everything else in the book. And the first one was looking at the gas economy and particularly pipelines in South Africa. And we ended up looking at a continental supply shift on power pools. So perhaps it's time to go over to Dan and say, people are lobbying against gas. We were, in fact, talking before, you were saying about how there are going to be class actions against more gas being used in South Africa. On the other hand, there are a number of major pipeline projects underway, and clearly the country has a very significant need for baseload, which gas, which is abundant in the Southern African region, could supply. So how are you seeing the situation on South African gas at the moment?
I think it's very interesting to see the degree to which kind of policy mindsets have shifted in South Africa in particular. I think the decarbonisation agenda has kind of taken off in a way that 2 years ago looked completely unimaginable, driven in part by Eskom, although that's at a very early stage and it's not completely clear where it's going to go and where it can go. And then most recently by Sasol, in its quite significant decarbonisation and energy transition announcements a week or so ago. And I think the kind of move by these giant emitters who are responsible for more than half of South Africa's greenhouse gas emissions to decarbonise alongside many in business. I mean, the Business Council, so Business Unity South Africa has been doing modelling on the energy transition for South African business and for the South African power sector with Boston Consulting Group and some others. And there's a big swing towards looking at it as a strategic thing, and this has implications for gas. Evidently, coal is more than 10 gigawatts of coal will be decommissioned over the next decade. It can't be at this particular point just replaced by renewables. I don't think anybody believes that that's possible in the industry. So gas is what people are looking to fill a gap. Now, there's a huge divide on gas. It's arousing a lot of passions in the industry. People getting very angry about attitudes in Europe in particular towards gas, where some interfering or perceived to be interfering European delegations are turning up in Mozambique and South Africa and lobbying, well, effectively saying that they shouldn't be advocating for gas at COP26. Equally, you've got politicians like Yemi Osinbajo and Nana Akufo-Addo calling for more, the need for more gas in Africa. In the industry argument is that it's simply not possible to run a system, a less greenhouse gas intensive electricity system without gas. And then the big switch has come to where this will come from. And now, the South African government had been looking at LNG imports, Richards Bay, Hooker and Saldanha Bay. That's still very much on the agenda, but really it looks like Rumco is now the kind of imports route of choice. Sasol is negotiating heads of terms, apparently is quite close to finalizing heads of terms for LNG offtake from Maputo, from the Matola FSRU project. It's not totally clear when that will come online. Sasol suggested it will be looking to take LNG around 2026, 2027, but people think that FID could be reached next year and it could be up and running quite a long time before then, potentially with commercial off-takers around around Johannesburg. So that's one option. Sasol is also looking at importing LNG from Richards Bay for competition and security of supply reasons, and then bringing that to its facilities in Secunda and Sasolburg via the Lily pipeline. But this is a much slower process, and I think it says a lot about South Africa that the regulation and everything else is getting in the way and making that slower than importing it via an import terminal in Mozambique. So there's been a lot of changes in attitude. I mean, some of this will really depend on Eskom as well. Sasol has said that it wants to replace its coal, 10 million tons a year of coal by 2020. Eskom also wants to use its coal sites around, which are close to Rumco, for gas. But there are big questions about whether Eskom can finance gas on its own, whether, there are meetings this week with EU, UK and US envoys in South Africa about a big financing package for decarbonisation. Is there any appetite amongst those kind of lenders to finance gas? I think that's a really big open question. It seems unlikely that out of COP26, the big international players are going to come out and say, here's a massive deal, financing for developing countries has come through, and it's going to be largely gas projects. It won't hit the political note that they're looking for. So that remains to be seen. So, but a lot of change.
There are a lot of imponderables, as you say. However logical gas works out in Southern Africa, it doesn't hit the right political note. Also, in the could argue Southern Cone package that we led off the book, I just note we had a very substantial analysis of situation in Mozambique, and particularly in the northern Rovuma basin, with a very interesting map updating where we are in the conflict, both in the north of Mozambique and the south of Tanzania, and looking particularly in some detail at the Rwandan intervention, looking at its financing and what it means. And this is a big strategic issue that seems to have unlocked the way for the very large Rovuma Basin export LNG projects to resume, and also points to the role that President Paul Kagame plays at a continental level for good and ill. Now, while we've got Dan on this call, the other thing that you wrote that really interested me was you wrote The View about our fortnightly editorial, and about the emerging role of power pools. I think it's very often easy to be cynical about African power pools, because with a few exceptions, like some of the things the Southern Africa power pool, the SAP, have done, things have moved slowly. But you actually gave, I thought, a very refreshing and balanced view of how power pools can come in and actually play a big role in supplying electricity and also promoting new forms of investment on the continent.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting moment for power pools. In particular, obviously, the Southern African power pool, SAP, which has now been operating for decades and has a long track record of prices and pricing information that developers can get into. And recently, well, I think last year, published guidance and rules for merchant IPPs to sell into the power pool. And this seems to be being taken up by pretty serious players. There's a lot of people looking at this who've done very intense analysis of the pricing, of the way that the pricing works, of matched and unmatched trades and things like that, and decided that they think they can finance projects off the back of it. You have players like, you have some big private equity funds who are looking at this. You have Solar Century and Shumba in Botswana, who are looking to be amongst the leaders. You've got Namibia playing a kind of fairly catalytic role in terms of opening up their market, both to selling to domestic off-takers, but also selling to IPP, selling to domestic off-takers, and IPPs also selling into SAP. And you have companies like Globelec signing early agreements with Natura Energy in Namibia for a plant that looks both domestically and potentially at SAP. So you've got some pretty serious players looking at this, and it starts to set up a potentially quite interesting dynamic whereby utilities are buying and selling on the power pool, but there tends to be a problem that utilities have the same oversupply at night and the same undersupply at peak. So everyone's trying to buy at the same time and everyone's trying to sell at the same time, makes for a lot of unmatched trades. You also have an increasing amount of transmission constraints, but IPPs are explicitly targeting those periods of undersupply across the board. And once you have that, you have quite a changing dynamic. All of a sudden, you're not completely in control of the market. You're not able to step in, and you don't even want to step in. But domestically, utilities and governments have been very protective of utilities. They've also been very jealously guarding their monopoly positions, and IPPs have found it very difficult to get off the ground. Also, it's very hard to bank the IPPs because they're having to sell to just one off-taker. All of a sudden, you're able to buy this power across the grid, and it's there without you having to do very much, in fact, potentially without you wanting it to be there. But once you're faced with power that you can just buy on the grids, and your peak time, you use it to prevent load shedding, reduce your cost of power, then you find, firstly, you find that suddenly your own market is in more competition. IPPs may set up in other countries to sell to you. Equally, there's more incentive to invest in transmission, because all of a sudden you may find that you as a utility are wanting to access this pool of power, but the transmission interconnection means that you can't, and you may see utilities starting to go to governments and asking for more investment in the interconnections, finally, which has been very much too slow. And then if you look beyond SAP, you've got perhaps even more forward-looking countries in East Africa. Tanzania's got third-party access rules. Kenya's got third-party access rules. Uganda also looking into selling cross-grid. Obviously, Ethiopia intending and very likely to be a kind of regional hub exporter. All potentially interconnected with SAP very soon, in the next few years, albeit initially trading bilaterally. West Africa also has interconnections are coming into play, and it's a while before these markets will be up and running, probably looking post 2030 really for actual trading. But it's coming together, and it will affect the dynamics of utilities and dynamics of markets. And I think disrupts, particularly policymakers at governments. I mean, I think the utilities quite welcome it. They don't like having to be the only off-taker all the time, especially when they can't actually get any power. Governments, also potentially like it. They should like it, because they don't have to provide sovereign guarantees. But on the other hand, have been very protective. So the slower-moving governments may find themselves all of a sudden, facing new pressures, and seeing basically investment going into other countries to sell to them, and jobs being created elsewhere, FDI going elsewhere, and them paying for it. So it's an interesting dynamic.
Great. Well, look, thanks for that, Dan, and always really good to think ahead. I don't think many people have been looking from that perspective, and it adds a lot to what we do. So that is a taste of what we had in issue 446, and issue 447 comes up next week, and we're looking for more of the same, but also different. Some of the countries we'll be looking at, particularly the dynamics in Somalia and its region, issues around the instability financing and what can happen in Sudan. There are people back looking at the South African issue. A tremendous amount of things going on in all sectors of the industry. And that's even before we start coming to what will be a welter of news around financing announcements. Will it actually be commitments that can be implemented that we're going to hear around COP? So I hope you've enjoyed our short conversation, and look forward to broadcasting again via the African Energy podcast very, very soon. Take care.